Have you ever thought about how important it is to have printed books in your own home? It's not just to have a beautiful bookshelf that you can show off to your friends, but it is important to preserve knowledge and information, especially in light of current events and technology. The web is full of information, but it's also changeable, revised, updated, and many things just quietly disappear from the internet. Ebooks can disappear. They can also be revised without your knowledge. So when you buy an ebook and you think it contains certain information, over time, the information contained in it can actually change without your knowing it. But real books in your house on your bookshelf, these are yours to keep. The internet has also been flooded recently by fake histories and AI photographs, videos. Some of them are very hard to discern from the truth. They're not only annoying, but they're fooling people into believing stories that are not true. This happens to me on a daily basis now, especially on my Facebook feed, and it probably does to you. All of this is why I created Knowledge Keepers Bookstore. And so in this podcast, I want to tell you about this project that I started in 2019 and how it's grown today and how you can get involved. Right now, Knowledge Keepers Bookstore carries 21 different history books that were written by the people who made history. So this includes journals, diaries, autobiographies, firsthand accounts, the stories of explorers and pioneers, founders, slaves, settlers, cowboys, soldiers, ordinary men and women in America, the big names, the names you've never heard of, all of this is included. What I do is seek out and reprint these old American history books and put them into affordable paperback form, exactly as they were written, and adding a few footnotes or photographs here and there to make them even more interesting and relevant. My hope with Knowledge Keepers Bookstore is to counter the problems that we see on the internet today. And I think the top 3 problems that we see, especially when it comes to history, and in this case, American history, is revisionist history, artificial intelligence, and the unreliability of the internet. So let's talk about those 3 quickly, and then I'm going to share with you the different Knowledge Keepers books that I have already. So the first one is revisionist history. And if you've been following me or my podcast for any length of time, you know I've covered this actually quite a bit, especially lately. In recent episodes of my podcast, I interviewed Mary Graybar about 2 of her books, Debunking Howard Zinn and Debunking the 1619 Project. Her entire premise in writing these books is to show how our history has been changed and revised to something that's very unrecognizable from what it was before the 20th century. And she talks about how our entire culture has changed as a result of especially Howard Zinn's effect on teaching American history in his book that's called The People's History of the United States of America. We also talked about the 1619 Project, which is a badly rewritten narrative that seeks to sort of turn the American founding up on its ear and give us a different one based on when the first slave came to America. Now, we should be studying when the slaves came here, and we should talk about all of the uncomfortable topics, but we don't have to do it by rewriting history. I recently did an episode on the twisted history of Christopher Columbus, and even more recently on the truth about the Pilgrim settlement at Plymouth Colony and the first Thanksgiving. This is a passion of mine, so I talk about it a lot. And before the podcast, I even wrote about it on my website, nickitruesdale.com. But the revisionist history that we are seeing today is so bad. It's so full of lies, and people don't even know what the truth is anymore because the revision has become so saturated in education and in culture and all over the internet. But lots of historical truth and facts were written down. As long as people could write, they've been writing down what happened in history. I want to give you an example from one of the books that I publish, which is called Miles Standish, Puritan Captain. It is by an author named John S.C. Abbott. I think this particular book was written in 1872, and I'll get to that in a minute. But what he says about the book that he wrote about Miles Standish, fortunately, there can be no doubt in reference to the essential facts. All these events have occurred within the last 300 years, a period fully covered by authentic historical documents. Wow, I just want to say amen to that, because that's how we know so much about our history. It happened in the modern age. It happened in a time of the Enlightenment, with numerous volumes of history and eyewitness accounts being written down as they happened. So we don't have to wonder, and we don't have to believe the guys that want to change our history. We just need to go back to the sources. The antidote to revisionist history is factual history, written down by the people who were there, who lived it, witnessed it, and took notes, and then verified by other contemporary sources. And you'll find that this is the case all across American history. Another thing that struck me when I was editing another one of the Knowledge Keepers books is how this untruth that's been floating around the internet for a long time was actually proven to be accurate. And so I want to give you an example. So just for a bit of background, I have been reprinting the Life of George Washington that was written by John Marshall in 1802 to 1804, I think is when he published it. And just so you know, John Marshall knew George Washington. He was a close friend of Washington's. He served with him in the Revolution. Then he served in George Washington's cabinet and eventually was on the Supreme Court. And all of the George Washington papers were given to him by the family of George Washington after his death so that Marshall could write this Life of George Washington. Now, it's very heavy on Revolutionary War history, but it is a priceless piece of history for Americans. However, I just want to tell you this one quote. You've probably seen this quote going around the internet over the last many years. It says, "The freedom of speech may be taken away, and dumb and silent we may be led like sheep to the slaughter." Now, I like to source quotes. If I see a good one, I want to know, is it real and where did it come from? And oftentimes you can find very little information on quotes. And this quote was one of them. I kept coming up against a brick wall when I would find this one. And basically the internet would say, well, George Washington didn't really say that. And so it's disappointing because I thought that's such a good quote. But if it's not real, I don't want to use it. But guess what? I was proven right. I have been saying for years that we can't trust the internet, but we can trust original sources like these old history books. So imagine my surprise when I was editing Volume 4 of The Life of George Washington by John Marshall and stumbled on this very quote. This is part of a 5-book series that was written by John Marshall. And in my Knowledge Keepers collection, I've already published the first 4. So I just have one more to go. So this quote comes from the one that's called Patriot Chief, and it basically it covers the life of George Washington from the end of the Revolution through the Constitution years and into his first presidency. And anyway, I'll talk more about the other books in the collection in just a few minutes. But I just want you to see that even the internet can say, oh, that didn't happen. And then when you find the old books, you realize maybe it actually did. Another thing is, if you read the journals of Christopher Columbus, you'll know that Indigenous Peoples Day is based on twisted phrases and outright lies. I could go on, but the point is that the internet is not your friend when it comes to history research. And that's what I want to get to next, is the unreliability of the internet. So I have a love-hate relationship with the internet, as probably most people do. It's super helpful in so many ways. All the information we could possibly want is at our fingertips. I get my groceries delivered to my front door, and I could not ask for a better life right now. But it also comes with a lot of confusion and complication because there is so much information on the internet. It's really hard to decide what's true and what's trustworthy. This is one of the reasons that we have to protect our kids from just unlimited access to the web, because there's so much confusion, so much, I hate to use the word misinformation, but that's what it is. There is a lot of it out there. But knowing whether you're reading the truth is tough, and it almost adds up to a part-time job just trying to search through sources and figure out what's true and what's not. But here's the thing. If you are researching something about history on the internet through blog posts or articles, encyclopedias, historic sites, you don't know what's counterfeit unless you already have some information about the truth. It's just like they say with the dollar bill. You can recognize a counterfeit dollar bill when you're intimately familiar with the actual dollar bill. That's how bankers are trained. Same thing for Christians. You can recognize false doctrine when you know true doctrine. And so that can be applied to history on the internet as well. If you already are familiar with the history as it was written down, as it happened, then you're going to notice the counterfeits so much more easily. Obviously, everyone has a bias, and everything on the web was created by humans with a bias. Even the AI results, which I'm going to get to next. Just like news sources, they all have a bias. They're either conservative or liberal. Very few are a balanced presentation of any story. Same thing goes for even what I used to consider trustworthy, like an official museum website. But I have learned that even official museum websites cannot always be trusted to present the actual truth. There's so much critical theory that has seeped into every aspect of history and society and culture that you don't know who to trust. There are plenty of factual sources, but there are also too many that are full of ignorance and outright lies. A couple examples are when you read that America's founders weren't Christians, or that they were deists, which is actually something I covered in my podcast on the Puritans. You'll read that settlers were generally all just greedy white European colonists and Indian killers, or that Americans were backwards and uneducated before the 20th century. If you read generalizations on the internet, you should just go ahead and steer away from those, because there's nothing general about American history. It's made up of individuals, and every white person didn't act the same. Every Indian didn't act the same. Every Black person did not act the same. There's so many human individual personalities involved in our history that you can't generalize, and you can't trust generalizations. So that covers the first two problems with history on the internet, and that is revisionist history and the unreliability of the internet. But now in the 21st century, the most recent part of the 21st century, we have a new one to fight, and that's artificial intelligence. So this is a controversial topic. Some people love AI, some people don't. I'm in the don't camp. I do understand that it has its benefits. I think they are limited, but what concerns me is just the use of it without question. And that's what I want to warn against, especially when we're talking about history. So it's distorted the truth in just about every arena and on every level. But people have been jumping on this bandwagon without questioning anything. But here's the thing, AI only regurgitates what's on the internet. So if you use any AI platform, let's say ChatGPT, for instance, and you ask it a question, it's going to give you a summary of what it is already on the internet. AI is not coming up with any new information. And as we just talked about, the internet is full of bad information. And the results of a ChatGPT search will echo what is the most prominent opinion online, and not necessarily what is true. And so let me just help you see this progression. Let's say someone posts an article. We don't have to assume this has happened. This is reality. I'm going to use Columbus for an example. Columbus just brought genocide to the New World. If most of the articles on the internet lean in that direction, and they do, then searching an AI platform like ChatGPT or others and asking what Columbus did, it's going to give you what's already most popular on the internet, or what is said the most times. And I don't know if you're aware of this, but people take what's on Wikipedia and they copy and paste, and you can read the same information word for word across multiple websites on one topic. And you realize these people are just copying each other. And this is not, it's not journalism, it's not research, it's just copy paste. And then you search it in AI, and this copy paste repetition is what gets brought to the surface. But it gets even worse than this. What if I told you that the National Archives intended to use AI to revise the American history records that they hold because of what they perceive as bias? So in 2021, Pamela Wright was, I don't believe she is anymore, was the Chief Innovation Officer at the National Archives. This is 2021. And she was speaking at the Artificial Intelligence and Machine Learning Virtual Information Day. And she said this: the records are biased and wrong. Therefore, we will use AI to create them because we believe in ethical AI. This should scare everyone, no matter what side of Columbus or Indians or pilgrims or George Washington or slavery you're on. This should scare everyone. Ethical AI is just another way to say rewriting history and language. If you don't believe me, I will put a link to this X post in the description of this podcast. The National Archives has holdings that date back to 1775, and I'm going to quote from their own website. These holdings capture the sweep of the past, slave ship manifests and the Emancipation Proclamation, captured German records and the Japanese surrender documents from World War II, journals of polar expeditions, photographs of Dust Bowl farmers, Indian treaties making transitory promises, and a richly bound document bearing the bold signature Bonaparte, the Louisiana Purchase Treaty that doubled the territory of the young republic. So the job of the National Archives is to be unbiased and just to be a collector and keeper of official records of the United States of America, not to interpret the records and definitely not to recreate them. But she said, I'm going to quote again, the records are biased and wrong. Therefore, we will use AI to recreate them because we believe in ethical AI. I'm sorry, this sounds like right out of a dystopian movie. If the National Archives cannot be trusted to preserve our written history, guess whose job it is? You and me. And that's why Knowledge Keepers is here to help. This is why I dig up old American history books and make them accessible and affordable in print. We must fight this part of AI. We've got to fight the creation of computer-generated information. Resist the artificial book. Resist books written by bots. Collect a home library where you fill it with old, authentic American history books that were written by people who knew the history. So let me introduce you to the Knowledge Keepers collection. In 2019, I started Knowledge Keepers and created a website as a way to share book lists of valuable books that I thought every home should own. And these are classic works of not just American history, but world history. And I just created several different lists. I searched other book lists and shared those too. And as time went on, I've always been a book collector, go to every sale I can find. And so I started picking up old books and reselling them that I found at library sales or thrift stores so that they could get into the hands of people that would appreciate them. But some of the books I would find were out of print and hard to find on the internet, if you wanted to order another copy. So I kept a lot of them for myself. But at the same time, I wanted more people to read these books because they were so good. I would just sit and read and think, wow, everyone needs to have this book. Everyone needs to know this story. Well, in 2020, I learned how to publish books on my own. And the first history book I printed that year was True Stories of Nebraska Pioneers. Now there are 21 books in the collection and it's still growing. So let me introduce you to the Knowledge Keepers book collection. And this is a chronological list. So they start at Columbus in 1492. And the most recent one, as far as the time period, is about the Wright brothers. So let's go back to Columbus. 1492, Christopher Columbus. This is 2 books in one. It's called His Story and His Journals. So in this 2-book volume, the second part of the volume is the actual journals of Christopher Columbus, edited by Edward Gaylord Bourne, who is a PhD, and it was published in 1906. So these are the original journals with editing by a historian. That's the second part of the book. The first part of the book is actually a narrative of Columbus's voyages and life based on those journals and letters. This one was published in 1892 on the 400th anniversary of Columbus's voyage by Edward Everett Hale. So it is easier to read than the journals, but is based on them. So you can open this book up, you can read the narrative of Columbus's life and voyages, and you can fact check it with the actual journals that he kept in the same book. One of my favorite things in this book is that it has over 700 footnotes by this historian, Edward Gaylord Bourne. And so when I read it, I learned things I'd never read before. And I grew up homeschooled, loving history and reading books like this. And I still learned so many cool things just from the footnotes of Christopher Columbus's journals. So that's the first book in the Knowledge Keeper series. Moving on down into the 1500s, Valiant Navigators, Sailors' Narratives of Voyages Along the New England Coast from 1524 to 1624. So this is classic exploration age, and there are 11 different stories of explorers who were sailing up and down the New England coast from 1524 for 100 years. And so what you get is a variety of letters, journals, or official documents that were sent back to monarchs in Europe. This one was originally published in 1905, and it includes the stories of David Ingram, Gosnold, Martin Pring, Samuel de Champlain, George Weymouth, Henry Hudson, John Smith, Thomas Dermer. If you've read any historic accounts of the explorers on the American coast, you'll recognize these names. And what's interesting in these is you get a lot of information about just people who had seen the New England coastline for the first time and wrote about it. Now, obviously, throughout history, there would be sailors who stumbled upon this land and just didn't know what they were looking at. But now they know that after Columbus, there's a continent and they're exploring it. And you'll read their descriptions of the coastline, the trees, animals, different plants that they encountered, and obviously meeting different Indian tribes up and down the coast. And you'll even see historic names like Squanto and Samoset. So this version was published in 1905, taken from the actual historic documents from the 15 and 1600s. I did not change the text, except that a lot of these were written in the old Elizabethan English, and so as carefully as possible, I updated the spelling and footnoted word usages so that it is more modern and easy to read. And of course, with each Knowledge Keepers book, I keep the original text as it is, but I add footnotes, maps wherever possible, portraits, anything like that that just adds to the story. Moving on down the centuries, 1620, I have 2 different books about the Pilgrims. The first one I just recently did a podcast on, which is called Thanksgiving, Puritans, and Christian Nationalism. But this book is called The First Year at Plymouth Plantation, which is a reprinting of what was originally known as Mort's Relation, a journal of the Pilgrims at Plymouth. And it's basically their 1-year diary of the Plymouth settlement. And this was originally published in 1622. And the version that I have reprinted was from 1963 with a lot of cool information added by historian Dwight Heath. I also annotated it with even more information. And so in this one, you get introductions about, the Plymouth colony and how this Mort's Relation letter came to exist. And then you get their actual 1-year diary that was written by William Bradford and Edward Winslow. And as a bonus, there's even Robert Cushman's sermon called The Dangers of Self-Love, which I included because it illustrates the Puritan ethic really nicely. Next up about the Pilgrims is a book called Miles Standish, Puritan Captain. I quoted from that author in this podcast. This one is not an eyewitness account, but it was published in 1872 based on the writings of the eyewitness accounts by William Bradford, William Brewster, Edward Winslow, John Robinson. And what he does is take all their writings and put them into a nice chronological narrative that's easy to read. You might have heard of the courtship of Miles Standish. That's in this book. So this is a really good one to read. And I will just say all of these books are suitable for all ages. Some of them may be a little more difficult to read because of the older language styles, but they're great to read aloud to your whole family. And many of them are absolutely readable for middle and high schoolers. This one, Miles Standish, I think is even probably suitable for elementary school readers. The next one in the series is the Iroquois Handbook. This one is so cool. I love referring back to this. It was published in 1818 under this title, History, Manners, and Customs of the Indian Nations Who Once Inhabited Pennsylvania and the Neighboring States by the Reverend John Heckewelder of Pennsylvania. So this is one of those books that is very valuable because it's a firsthand account of the life among the Iroquois. And it was written by an Englishman, obviously. The reason this is important, and the reason this one is important especially, is because the Indian tribes didn't have written languages, and so they did not have a way to write down books and histories. They had many verbal histories that have been passed down, but a written account is very valuable, in my opinion, more so than a verbal account, because it's kind of like playing a game of telephone. When you tell a story over and over and tell it to the next person and they tell it to the next person, things get changed or left out or forgotten. But when it's written down at the time, it's a lot more verifiable. And so this book was written by a man named John Heckewelder, and he lived among the Iroquois for 30 years as a missionary. He was friends with them. They treated him as family, and he wrote down basically an encyclopedia of what it was like to live among the Iroquois. It's really cool because it's short chapters, and each chapter is based on one tiny aspect of their lives. So if you've got a kid who wants to know how the Iroquois Indians lived, this is the book. Little chapters like on cooking, warfare, child raising, religious beliefs, all of that. What's even more interesting is that there's quite a large introduction and then a lot of information in the back of the book about their languages. And it's really cool to see how much Iroquois influence has been brought to American words. Because we're so used to thinking, well, we speak English and it's derived from Latin. You'd be surprised how many American English words actually come from some of these Iroquois words. It's really cool. Anyway, that's called the Iroquois Handbook, and I highly recommend it for anyone who loves studying the history of the Indian nations. The next one is from 1773. It's called Virginia Tudor, The Journal and Letters of Philip Vickers Fithian. This is a one-year diary from a man who lived in Virginia. He was hired to be a tutor to a prominent wealthy family in Virginia for 1 year, and he kept a diary of it. Now, this is a story among the upper classes of Virginia society. Fithian was actually a student of John Witherspoon, who was quite the founding father, and he was sent to be a tutor to Robert Carter's 7 children in Virginia. So you get a lot of information about education, about family life in this home, the kids, the customs of the Virginia gentry, slavery, politics, farming, all kinds. And the Carters were friends with quite a few prominent families in Virginia, including the Washingtons and the Lees. So it's just full of interesting history. This journal was first published in 1900, and then this edition that I reprinted is a 1957 version released by Colonial Williamsburg. I obviously added some footnotes, maps, and drawings and portraits and other things to bring it even more up to date. But again, the original text is just as it was written. Now let's move forward to 1776. I have published Able and Mighty Men, biographies of the men who signed the Declaration of Independence. This is one of my most popular titles, and I know there are other biographies of the signers of the Declaration, but are they written by someone who met or knew almost every single signer? That's what makes this one so unique. It was originally published in 1838, and the author, Carroll Judson, knew almost every one of these signers. He also includes a biography of George Washington and Patrick Henry, as well as the first draft and the final draft of the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and George Washington's farewell address. This is classic American history right here. It's a big one. It's 557 pages. Moving into the 1800s now. In 1844 is when True Stories of Nebraska Pioneers begins. So this one was originally published by the Daughters of the American Revolution in 1916. And these are firsthand accounts written and sent into the Daughters of the American Revolution by all kinds of different people who settled Nebraska in the 1800s. And so you'll get really short stories or letters that take up several pages, and they just tell about what brought them to Nebraska, how they got there, how they built their home. Were they married? Did they have children? Did they farm? Did they start other businesses? It's really fun because it's multiple different accounts of Nebraska pioneers. So this was the first one that I published in the Knowledge Keeper series and is still very popular. Diary of a New York Girl. This one starts in 1852 when a young New York girl started keeping a journal of her everyday life. And for 20 years, she just kept track of ordinary events and also some very famous ones like the American Civil War, the assassination of President Lincoln, and she even attended famous people's speeches like Charles Spurgeon and a couple of others. This diary was finally originally published in 1913. And of course, I added whatever footnotes about updated information I could find. I also included the first and second inaugural addresses of President Lincoln in this one. It's an amazing piece of history by an average American, and these are some of my favorite kinds. The next one in the series is from 1854. This one is called A Very Small Farm. It was originally published under the name 10 Acres Enough by Edmund Morris. And it tells of how he decided to sell his business in the city, move out to the country, and start a homestead with his wife and his big family. He had a lot of kids. And he just details how they went from buying a rundown piece of property to fixing it up and growing everything they needed to survive as well as to make an income. So it's a snapshot of American history in the early 1800s, but it's also a really cool book on homesteading and self-sufficiency. Memories of a Trailblazer. Original story is 70 Years on the Frontier by Alexander Majors. Now, I don't know if you'll recognize that name, but you've probably heard of the Pony Express or the Santa Fe Trail. This is the guy who started the Pony Express. And what's so fun is he wrote his own autobiography because even he recognized, looking at his life, how big a sweep of American history he had lived through. And so it talks about when he first was, I think, 5 years old in St. Louis, Missouri, which is where the West really began at this time in America in the 1850s or 60s. And how he was there at 5 years old with his father. And then at the end, he talks about all the changes that had happened since he was 5 years old and how the West had changed so much and how America had changed so much and how he witnessed all of it. And so it's kind of a front row seat to things like the Mexican-American War, the gold discoveries, silver mines, the telegraph, the Mormon migration, and so much more. He established a freight line on the Santa Fe Trail. And then, as I said, he invented the Pony Express. And he was friends with Buffalo Bill Cody. Anyway, it's a really fascinating autobiography. And I think any kid will enjoy it, but everyone will. This one is about Robert E. Lee, and he's another controversial figure in American history. And so I felt it was a really good idea to publish a book about him. This is not his autobiography, but it's close enough. So this one, it's two books in one. The first part is called A Life of General Robert E. Lee by a man named John Eston Cook. It was originally published in 1876. And John Eston Cook submitted his manuscript to Robert E. Lee for approval and was given the approval. So it's not an autobiography, but it is an approved biography by General Lee himself. And it's a really neat mix of war stories and commentary on the general's life and character. And of course, it's been printed in its original form. So woven throughout this biography is a collection of letters that Robert E. Lee's son, Captain Robert E. Lee, collected and published. And so I took the letters by date and published them through, you just kind of spread them throughout the book as the biography moves along. So you get to read the biography and relevant letters as General Lee wrote them or received them from people in his family. And it has so much history because Robert E. Lee was the descendant of Revolutionary War hero Harry Lighthorse Lee, and he married George Washington's granddaughter. He was fiercely devoted to the United States, and you'll see that in this book because modern history has just distorted everything about Robert E. Lee and made him out just to be an evil Southerner and Confederate, but there was a lot more to this man than most people are willing to see. And that's why a book written in 1876 to me is a lot more preferable when studying his life. I also have Autobiography of a Mississippi Slave. This was from 1865. This man was Lewis Hughes. He was born into slavery in 1832, and he gained his freedom at the end of the Civil War on the 4th of July, which I think is really cool. But he was a slave, and then he got freedom and learned how to read and write, and he wrote and published his own story, which is so valuable to American history. So there's plenty of opinions and sides about the Civil War, but I think that these narratives of people who lived it are the most important ones. And when you come out of reading, the Mississippi slave autobiography and the General Lee story, you realize it's kind of hard to just generalize anyone from this time period because it's so complicated. But I think it's very important that we read about what happened to the slaves, and obviously some of them did not have happy endings like Lewis Hughes, but this one is so good because he gives you the truth about slavery and life as a slave, but then it has a happy ending because he gained his freedom. And I would say this one is suitable for kids. There's a couple of descriptions of some punishments, but I don't think that they're too graphic. They're just enough to help people understand what it was really like. This one was originally published in 1897. The next one is about the Oregon Trail. This one is called Freighters and Pilgrims, Two Stories of Western Immigration. And it has two different diaries of people going west on the Oregon Trail in the same year, almost on the same part of the trail, but these people never knew each other. So these both happened in 1865. One was a young man who was 19 named Charles, and he and two of his friends decided to go see what the West had to offer them. And so they took the trail as part of mule teams, and so that's why they're called freighters, because they were helping carry freight west. And his story has Indian attacks, blizzards, mountain lions, all kinds of things. And so this one is really cool. The other diary of the Oregon Trail is by a young lady named Sarah, who was 24, and she and her family were on the classic wagon train headed for California, and she kept a diary. So these are both true stories, both firsthand accounts of the trip that so many Americans traveled over many decades of the 19th century. And I just put two of them together in this book called Freighters and Pilgrims. Next up is The Diary of a Cowboy. I love this one so much. This is one of the ones I read and thought, okay, I've got to add this to my collection. You might have heard of Log of a Cowboy. I have that one in my collection, and I gave it an additional title called Up the Western Trail. And this is a really good story by Andy Adams. He took many cattle drives from Texas up to the north to take cattle to the railroads. And he sort of combined several of his trips into one narrative, and he gives a mile by mile detail of a drive from the Rio Grande in Texas to the Blackfeet Indian Reservation in Montana, one of the longest cattle drives to be undertaken. It's really fun to read, and it backs up all the experiences that I've read from other cowboy diaries or interviews. So this one was originally published in 1903 under the title Log of a Cowboy. And as usual, I have added some maps of the Western Trail and old photos of cowboys and cattle drives. And following the chronological history, the latest one in the series is about the Wright brothers. It's called Aeroplane. It was originally published in 1943. And this one is written by Fred C. Kelly, who is the only authorized biographer of the Wright brothers. It was specifically authorized by Orville Wright. And so I like this book because while it tells their story, it's not overly technical when it comes to flight and airplanes. It gives you enough information to show why they were revolutionary, but it's their story too. It's about these two brothers. And there's a lot of interesting information I did not even know. And in fact, Orville Wright spent years in lawsuits protecting their legacy from the Smithsonian. So there's a lot of really interesting information from this one, and I think you'll enjoy that. The Christmas stories that I've published has become very popular. It's called American Christmas Stories Volume 1. And so what I did was just started digging for stories of how Christmas has looked in America. And so there are little narratives that span 1773 to 1926. It's just a patchwork of all different kinds of things, including stories of homesteaders, colonists, soldiers, newspaper editors, children. There are some historic customs and even some recipes. So this is called American Christmas Stories Volume 1 because I still plan to publish another volume soon. And then finally, I mentioned The Life of George Washington. This is a 5-volume series, and I have so far published the first 4 volumes. But this was written and published between 1804 and 1807 by John Marshall. He was a friend of the president, a friend of the Washington family, and he was given all of the president's papers after his death to write this biography. And what's really cool in volume 1, it's more of an introduction to American history, and Washington is only mentioned in the very end of it. But it's the coolest evolution of the histories of the colonies that I've ever read, because what he does is lays the groundwork for the time when Washington would take his place in history. And so he details from the discovery of the North American continent by Cabot through the various charters and settlements all along the Atlantic coast to the French and Indian War and into the American Revolution. And then we're introduced to George Washington. But this book alone is a fascinating look at the history of the American colonies like none that I've ever read before. Volume 2 spans the year 1732 to 1778, which brings us Washington's birth through the Battle of Saratoga, from a major in the British Army to the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. So we're 2 years into the Revolution by the time this book ends. Volume 3 spans the year 1778 to 1781, and Volume 4 is from 1781 to 1793. And Volume 5 will be coming soon. So that is a rundown of the 21 books so far in the Knowledge Keepers series. And I think you will enjoy more than one of these titles, no matter what your family looks like or what your interest in history. All of these are available on Amazon. I have an Amazon store, and so I'll leave the link for that in this description. But the reason I do this is to encourage people to have the actual American history knowledge and to keep it. That's why it's called Knowledge Keepers. I encourage people to not just read it online, but to own printed copies of our history. Keep them on your bookshelf, read them to your children or with your children, and pass them down to your children and grandchildren, and keep our history intact despite internet, despite artificial intelligence and e-readers and all the things that can be revised and even disappeared. You can hold on to our history and pass it down to future generations. If more homes would do this, it would change the way Americans see their history. So I'm begging you to make your home library just a little bit bigger and preserve the story of American history and Western civilization. Teach it to the younger generations. That is what Knowledge Keepers is all about. So in closing, I just want to say you can't store knowledge in a cloud. It has to be in print. It needs to be in print everywhere. These real books need to be passed down to our descendants, but not just in unopened and unread books. When you buy the books, read them and know what's really in our history. Don't get your history from a web page. Get it from the people who lived it, saw it, and made it. I am so glad that you joined me today for this podcast, and I hope you'll check out the Knowledge Keepers collection. They make great Christmas gifts, birthday gifts, but they also go well with any homeschool curriculum. I also actually have a free guide on my website for how to use these books with any curriculum you already have in your homeschool. So I'll link that below too, and I hope you'll make use of these books in your home library. Thank you for listening to my podcast today. If you want more content like this, you can go to my website at nickitruesdell.com. That's NICKITRUESDELL.com. And find me on Facebook, Instagram, and X. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.